Wyoming Territory, 1878. The wind carried dust and desperation down the main street of Larkspur Ridge, and that was the day Virginia Dowlen's brother sold her for $50 and a bottle of rye. The sun was just tipping over the edge of the mountains when Virginia stood barefoot in the dirt outside the saloon, arms crossed tight around her chest, chin trembling. She was 19. Her dress was torn at the hem and damp at the collar where she had cried, but her eyes were still sharp, still searching for a way out. Her brother, Mason, leaned against the doorway of the saloon, laughing with the man who had just handed him the money. Virginia had not heard his name, only saw the yellowed teeth and the way his hand had clutched her arm too tight when Mason shoved her forward. "You said you'd take care of me," she had whispered when Mason grabbed her wrist. "You promised after Ma died." He had not looked her in the eye. The man who bought her was headed north with a string of mules, and Virginia knew what her life would be if she went with him. She had heard stories whispered by other girls, seen fear in the faces of women too bruised to speak. She would not survive it. Then came the sound of hoofs. Slow, steady, deliberate. A tall man on horseback rode into town as if the dust and noise did not touch him. He wore a plain brown coat, the collar sun-bleached, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. His horse was a deep red, strong and quiet. He passed the saloon, reined in, and turned back. His name was Declan Dorsey. He had been driving cattle south and stopped in Larkspur Ridge for supplies. What he found instead was Virginia, standing in the dust, being bartered like livestock. He dismounted. "You selling her?" Declan's voice was low, but it cut through the noise like a blade. The mule driver puffed out his chest. "Ain't your business." Declan stepped between them without flinching. "It is now." Virginia blinked. She did not know him. But there was nothing leering in his gaze. He looked at her like she was a person. Like she mattered. The mule driver reached for his belt, but Declan already had a hand on his revolver. "Walk away," he said, calm as a creek. "You do not want to find out what comes next." The man spat, muttered something foul, and backed off. Mason stepped forward then, face flushed. "You do not get to just take her." Declan turned to him. "You sold her. You gave up your rights the moment you took that bottle." Mason looked at his sister, but there was no remorse in his eyes. Just fear of the man in front of him. Declan looked to Virginia. "You want to come with me?" She hesitated. She could not trust anyone. Not after Mason. Not after all the men who had looked at her like she was something to use. But Declan was not touching her. He was not dragging her. He was offering. She nodded. Declan helped her onto the horse behind him. She held the saddle horn, not him. He did not speak again until they were miles outside town. "You got anywhere else to go?" he asked. Virginia shook her head. "Then come with me. I got a little place down near Laramie. Not much, but it is safe. You can stay as long as you want." "Why are you doing this?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He glanced over his shoulder. "Because someone should have done it sooner." They rode in silence after that. The land stretched wide, golden under the fading sun. Virginia's hands were cold. She gripped the saddle tighter. That night, they camped under a cottonwood near a narrow creek. Declan built a fire and handed her a blanket and some jerky. He slept across from her, his back to the fire, his gun resting beside him. He never once looked at her the way Mason's friends had. And when she woke in the night sweating from a nightmare, he did not ask questions. Just handed her his spare coat and said, "You are safe now." Virginia did not know what to make of him. He hardly spoke. But every motion was steady, every word meant something. He treated her like she mattered. And that was new. By the third day on the trail, her guard began to crack. "You live alone?" she asked one morning as they rode. "Yeah," he said. "Been that way a while." "No wife?" He shook his head. "Not yet." Virginia looked away. She had never thought about marriage. Not really. not after the way men had treated women in her life. But Declan was different. He did not try to charm her. He did not try to win her. He just saw her. They made it to his homestead on the fourth day. A modest cabin tucked into a grove of aspens, a corral out back, a few chickens pecking near the porch. It was not much, but it was everything she had never had. Declan showed her the extra room. "It is yours," he said. "I will sleep in the barn if you want the place to yourself." She stared at him. "You do not have to do all this." "I know." He looked at her then, really looked. "But I want to." That night, she stood on the porch and watched the stars. He came up beside her, quiet as always. "I do not know how to live like this," she said. "Safe. Wanted." He turned to her. "You do not have to know. Just stay. Let it come." She nodded, and for the first time in years, she believed it might be possible. In the weeks that followed, Virginia began to smile again. She helped with the chickens, mended the curtains, swept the porch. Declan always thanked her, even for little things. He chopped wood, fixed the roof, and brought her wild flowers without saying a word about them. He never touched her without permission. Never raised his voice. Never made her feel small. One evening, he found her crying behind the barn. She tried to hide it, but he just sat beside her in the dirt. "You are allowed to feel things," he said. "You are not broken." She looked at him, eyes wet. "I do not want to be afraid forever," she whispered. "Then let us build something that chases it away," he said. And she believed him. By the first snow, she realized she had not looked over her shoulder in weeks. Had not flinched at a raised voice. She had not just survived, she had begun to live. And every time Declan looked at her, she felt steadier. She was not just safe. She was home. The snow came heavy that winter, early and without warning. Declan had finished hauling in the last of the firewood by the time the first flakes began to fall. Virginia stood in the doorway, apron tied at her back, hands still dusted with flour from the biscuits cooling on the table. "We'll need to salt the rest of that venison," she said, not looking at him. "If it keeps at this pace, we won't get out for weeks." He brushed his gloves off against his coat. "I'll cut it down after supper. You want to help? I've never done it before." "All right. I'll show you." They sat close that night at the table, 2 bowls of stew between them, the oil lamp casting a long shadow against the wall. It was the first time she'd eaten without watching the door. Declan ate slow, careful with his spoon, like food was something to be respected. She noticed that about him, how he never wasted anything, not words or movement, not warmth. "You always live in Wyoming?" she asked. He set his spoon down. "No. Grew up near Abilene. Left when I was 17. Nothing there for me." She waited, thinking he might say more, but he didn't. "You got family still there?" He shook his head. "None that I'd call on." "I understand that." The silence came easy, not awkward. After supper, he showed her how to slice the meat thin and pack it in salt. His hands worked slow, methodical, like he'd done it 100 times. She followed his movements, watching how he used the back of his knife to press down each layer. By the time they finished, the wind had picked up outside, brushing against the cabin walls like a slow breath. Declan added another log to the stove and sat back. "You read?" he asked, nodding toward the shelf tucked near the hearth. "A little. Not much chance for it before." He pulled down a worn copy of The Prairie Traveler and handed it to her. "Not much story in it, but it's good to know things." She turned the pages, fingers tracing the margins. "You ever been out past the Rockies?" "No. Thought about it. But the land here's got enough weight for a man." "Weight?" He looked at the window, where the snow pressed soft against the glass. "Some places ask more of you. This is one of them." She didn't reply, but the words stayed with her. The days passed slow. They settled into a quiet rhythm, feeding the animals, boiling water for laundry, mending what needed mending. Declan never hovered. He showed her where things went, how the stove flue stuck sometimes, how to catch the rooster without getting scratched, and then he let her be. One afternoon, she found an old wooden box beneath the bed in the spare room. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, tied with a strip of faded cotton. She didn't open them. That night, after the fire burned low, she asked him, "You were in the war?" He nodded once. 4th Texas Infantry. She waited, but he didn't say anything more. "I won't ask," she said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I carried a Bible in my coat pocket. My brother gave it to me. He was younger. Died before I got back." She looked at his hands, at the seams of his knuckles. "I'm sorry. He was 16. Took a fall off a ridge hunting deer. Alone." Virginia traced the grain of the table with her thumb. "My mother passed slow. Consumption. There wasn't much left when she went. Just me and Mason." Declan didn't speak, but she saw something shift in his posture. Not pity. Recognition. "I don't know how to stop expecting people to turn cruel," she said. "You don't have to stop. Just don't let it keep you from seeing when they don't." She nodded once. The clock ticked from the mantel. The snow softened every sound outside. That night, she left her door open. He didn't say anything about it in the morning, just poured her coffee and passed the butter without a word. In late January, the roof near the stove began to leak. Declan climbed up in the cold while she held the ladder steady. He worked until his hands were raw, and when he came back down, she wrapped them in cloth and warmed water for a soak. "You didn't have to do that yourself," she said. "I don't mind the doing. I mind the waiting." "For what?" "For things to fall apart." She pressed his hand gently into the basin. "Not everything does." He looked at her then, long and quiet. "I hope you're right." By February, the snow began to ease. The chickens laid again, and the days stretched a little longer. Virginia planted seedlings and cut tin cans along the sill. Declan built a new latch for the barn door, humming under his breath while he worked. One evening, walking back from the creek with a bucket of water between them, she stopped halfway. "I want to stay," she said. He didn't answer right away. Just looked at her, the wind lifting the edge of her shawl. "I'd like that," he said finally. She shifted the bucket to one hand and reached for his. He let her take it. By early March, the thaw had begun in earnest. The fields behind the cabin softened underfoot, and the creek ran clearer each morning. Virginia stood near the edge of the pasture, watching the sun stretch over the hills, her hands tucked into the sleeves of a wool coat Declan had mended for her when the wind tore a seam along the cuff. He was in the barn, fitting new shoes to the mare, his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a smear of ash across one cheek from the forge. She hadn't meant to stare, but something about the way he moved, quiet, sure, patient, held her still. She waited until he hung the tools and stepped out into the daylight, wiping his hands on a rag. "I want to learn how to ride," she said. Declan raised an eyebrow but didn't hesitate. "Bareback or saddle?" "Saddle. For now." He nodded, then whistled low. The sorrel gelding came up from the far end of the paddock without needing coaxing. "His name's Hopper. Not much to look at, but he's steady." Virginia ran her hand along the horse's neck. "I'm not sure if steady's what I need, or if I need to learn how to be." Declan didn't answer, just offered her a leg up. She swung into the saddle, unsteady for a beat before finding her balance. He walked beside her as she circled the fence line, correcting her grip on the reins, reminding her to sit back on the turns. When she leaned too far forward, he reached up and steadied her by the knee. "Don't fight the horse so much," he said. "Let him meet you halfway." She laughed under her breath. "That sounds like something else entirely." He glanced at her, and for the first time, let a faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe it is." Later, back inside, she rubbed her thighs and winced. "I didn't think riding would feel like I got kicked all over." You'll toughen up, he said, pouring her a mug of boiled chicory. You already are. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. You always been this quiet? Not always. Used to talk too much, when I was younger. Thought it'd win me something. And now? Now I think most things worth saying don't need many words. She didn't reply, just watched the steam curl between them. That night, after the fire burned down and the ashes glowed low, she stood by the window with her arms crossed, eyes on the horizon. You ever miss it? She asked. The road cattle drives moving. Declan leaned against the doorway, arms folded. Sometimes. But drifting's only sweet if you know where you'd go back to. You have a place now? I do. She turned from the window, her face unreadable. So do I. The next morning, a letter came. Brought by a trapper passing through, wrapped in oilskin and bearing Mason's name. Declan handed it to her without comment. She read it by the stove, lips pressed tight. When she finished, she stared at it for a long time before folding it once and sliding it into the fire. I don't want to speak his name anymore, she said. You don't have to. He's in Cheyenne. Says he's got work now. Says he was sorry. Declan didn't move. You believe him? I don't think it matters. She stepped closer to the fire, watching the flame catch the edge of the paper. I don't hate him. But I won't carry him either. He didn't reach for her, didn't interrupt. Just stood beside her, silent, letting the heat do its work. The days grew longer. They cleared the ice from the well, patched the chicken coop, and planted carrots in the softening soil. Declan built a frame for early beans, and Virginia carved a row of notches into the windowsill to mark each day of warmth. One afternoon, she brought out a small wooden box she'd kept beneath the bed. Inside were squares of calico, a spool of blue thread, and a needle bone-handled and worn. I want to make a quilt, she said, laying the fabric across the table. Something that might last. Declan ran his hand over the patterned pieces. You plan to stay long enough to finish it? I plan to start it, she said. That's enough for today. He didn't argue. Some evenings, they sat outside after supper, sharing silence as the light faded behind the ridge. She brought a book sometimes, reading aloud when the words called for it. He whittled rough shapes from pine scraps, hands steady even after long days. One dusk, as the light drained slow and gold over the hills, she set the book aside. I never asked what you want, she said. Not just what you'll allow, but what you hope for. Declan rubbed his thumb over the carved edge of the wood in his lap. A home that doesn't vanish when I turn around. Someone to share it. She watched him carefully. And if she's still learning how to trust it? I'd be foolish to expect her not to be. The wind picked up softly, brushing her hair across her cheek. She leaned toward him, just enough to feel the quiet shift between them. Then I hope you keep carving, she said. And I'll keep stitching. Declan looked at her, the last of the light catching in his eyes. Deal, he said. By April, the thaw had sunk deep into the ground, and the last of the ice had pulled back from the creek banks. Virginia had taken to rising before sunrise, not from fear as she once had, but from habit, drawn by the quiet hour before the birds began and the light curled over the hills. She'd sit on the porch with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, mending seams or trimming dried herbs from the windowsill pots she'd coaxed back to life. Declan had taken to trusting her decisions without weighing them aloud. He'd begun drawing plans for a root cellar, marking the slope behind the barn with a stick and string, and asking her opinion without pretext. You think it'll hold here? He asked one morning, crouched in the dirt, thick calluses lining his palms. She stepped beside him, brushing her fingers over the soil. If we brace the back wall with that pine from the ridge, it will. He looked up at her, chin shaded beneath the brim of his hat. You're sure? I am. He nodded once and stood. Then that's where we'll dig. Later that week, a lean woman and a boy of about 12 arrived on foot, their wagon broken down along the trail near the old telegraph pole. Declan had seen the smoke from their stranded camp and ridden out without hesitation. He returned with the pair riding double behind him, the woman's face drawn tight with worry, the boy clinging to her waist. Virginia met them at the gate, her hands already dusted with flour from baking. "They been out there long?" she asked as Declan helped the woman down. He shook his head. 2 days. Lost a wheel and near lost a mule to it. The woman's voice was clipped but courteous. "Cora Bell. This here's Jessie. We're headed to Medicine Bow to meet my brother, but I reckon we'll need a few days' rest if it's no trouble." "No trouble," Virginia said, already turning to lead them inside. "There's hot food and a bed if you're not particular." Cora's shoulders eased a bit. "We ain't particular." That evening, Jessie sat cross-legged near the hearth, turning over one of Declan's wood carvings in his hands. Virginia watched from the table, her needle paused mid-stitch. "You made this?" Jessie asked. Declan nodded. "Started shaping it from a fence post that cracked. It's got real eyes," the boy murmured. "Like it's thinking." Declan met Virginia's eyes across the room. "Sometimes I think things made slow hold more truth." After the pair had gone to sleep in the spare room, Virginia leaned against the table, arms folded. "I forgot how it felt to have strangers in the house," she said. "You minded it?" "No." She hesitated, then added, "It just reminded me how far I've come." Declan put a tin of tobacco back on the shelf. "You came farther than most would." She stepped closer, close enough to catch the scent of cedar and iron from the barn. "You ever think about what comes after all this?" He didn't move. "I do. And I think about what it'd be like to come back from a long ride and see you here. I think about walking into this house and knowing you're part of it." Virginia didn't answer at first. Her hands were still, resting on the edge of the table. Then, soft but certain, "I've been thinking about that too." The room was quiet, save for the low creak of the stove cooling behind them. "I never figured I'd be someone's home," she said. "You are," he said. "You just hadn't been asked?" She reached for his hand, the first time without hesitation. "Then ask?" Declan's fingers curled around hers, the calluses rough against her skin but steady. "Stay. Not just for the season. Not just for the planting. Stay for good." Her voice didn't waver. "Yes." Outside, the wind stirred the grass. Inside, the fire burned low, casting their shadows long and side by side. They stood there like that, hand in hand, no need for promises spoken too loudly. What they had was built already in the mended seams, in the loosened silence, in the quiet trust that had rooted itself deeper than either had expected. And this time, she wasn't waiting to be taken. She had chosen. The first calf was born under a sky thick with spring rain, its coat slick and dark, trembling in the grass beside its mother. Declan found it early, before the light had fully lifted, and brought it in beneath the lean-to while Virginia waited with dry burlap and a shallow pan of warmed milk. The calf blinked up at her, all legs and instinct, and nudged toward her hand with hesitant trust. "He's strong," she said, brushing water from its ears. "He'll make it." Declan tied off the rope he'd used to secure the mother and stepped back, watching them. "You've got a way with things that haven't had much kindness." Virginia looked up from the calf. "So do you." By late morning, the storm passed, leaving the pasture sodden but bright. Virginia walked the fence line while Declan cleared debris from the creek mouth. The world around them had changed, though nothing dramatic marked it, only the small, steady signs of something new taking root. They met again near the shed, boots caked with mud, sleeves rolled past the elbow. He leaned on the fence rail, watching her shake the water from her braid. "You ever think about what kind of life you want from here forward?" he asked. "I do," she said. "But it keeps shifting." "How so?" "I used to think safety was enough. Then I wanted quiet. Then I wanted to feel useful. Now," she paused, eyes on the barn where the calf rested, "I want all of it. And someone to share it with." Declan nodded once. "That's fair." She reached for his hand without hesitation. "What about you?" I want to build something that outlasts me. Not just wood and wire, but something you can look at and know it was made with care. That it wasn't rushed. That it mattered. Virginia let silence settle between them before she spoke again. Then we're after the same thing. The next week, Jessie helped Declan dig the root cellar while Cora stitched a new apron from the cloth Virginia had saved since winter. The boy took to the work easily, asking questions that Declan answered with more than just words. He showed him how to brace the walls with cross beams, how to tamp the soil so it wouldn't shift in rain. Most of what passed between them was practical, but Virginia noticed the way Jessie stood taller each evening, the way Cora no longer kept one hand on her son's shoulder at every turn. One afternoon, as Virginia gathered eggs from the coop, Cora appeared at the fence, arms crossed but eyes softer than before. "You've done more for us than I can repay," she said. "It was never about payment," Virginia replied. Cora nodded. "I know. That's what makes it harder to leave. You've got people waiting? My brother's expecting us by the start of summer. He's got land near the river. Said there's room for both of us." Virginia glanced toward the barn. "Jesse's learned a lot here." "He has. So have I." They stood quietly a moment, the hens clucking low behind them. "I hope you find what you're after," Virginia said. "I think you already have." When Cora and Jessie left 3 days later, Declan rode out with them to the trail fork, returning just before dusk with his coat damp and his face unreadable. "She said thank you?" he said, tying the mare to the post. "I didn't do anything she wouldn't have done. You gave her room to breathe. That's not nothing." That night, Virginia pulled the finished quilt from the frame and laid it across the bed. It was made of scraps and salvaged pieces cloth from her mother's old nightdress, a swatch of Declan's worn work shirt, the corner of a flour sack that once held early winter potatoes. She traced the seams with her fingers, feeling the pull of every stitch. He came in from the wash basin, drying his hands on a towel. "You finished it." "I did." He stepped close, one hand resting on the edge of the bed. "It's beautiful. I didn't make it to be that. I made it to last." Declan looked at her then, not searching, not questioning. Just seeing. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the preacher who comes through from Rawlins every few months. He's due next week." Virginia folded the quilt back with care. "You want to ask him something?" "I do." She turned. "Then ask me first." He took her hand. "Marry me. Not for show, not for safety. Just because I can't think of a day ahead I want to spend without you in it." She didn't hesitate. "Yes." They married beneath the cottonwoods behind the house, with the preacher standing beside the fence, and the creek running slow behind them. No guests, no paper flowers, just the mountains watching and a sky so wide it made Virginia feel like nothing from her past could ever pull her back. Declan wore his cleanest shirt, collar stiff and hair combed with care. Virginia wore the dress she'd stitched from calico and wool, her mother's brooch pinned at her throat. They spoke their vows with clear voices, hands joined, eyes steady. Afterward, they shared a meal of roast rabbit and cornbread, and the preacher rode on before nightfall. They stayed out on the porch as the light faded, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "You ever think you'd have this?" he asked quietly. "I never thought I'd want it," she said. "But now that I have it, I can't imagine wanting anything else." He kissed her temple, slow and sure. "Then we've got it right." By summer, the garden had taken hold, and the fields beyond were thick with wildflowers. The house smelled of fresh bread and split pine. The quilt stayed on the bed, even through the warm nights, and Virginia often woke with Declan's arms still curled around her waist, their breaths matched like the rise and fall of the hills that sheltered them. The root cellar held jars of pickled beans and dried apples. The calf was nearly grown, walking steady beside its mother. Jessie wrote once, in blocky letters, to say they'd planted corn and that his uncle had taught him to fish. Cora added a line at the bottom, "Thank you for giving us time to begin again." Virginia hung the letter by the door. Some days she sat on the porch alone, sowing or shelling peas, while Declan mended a fence or turned the soil. They didn't speak much on those days, but they didn't need to. Everything that had once been uncertain had settled into shape. There would be hard seasons ahead, no doubt. Drought, sickness, maybe loss. But they'd meet it together, with hands that knew work and hearts that had learned to trust. And when the wind came through the valley, it no longer sounded like something to run from. It sounded like home.